21 hours. That is how long some of the most senior diplomatic minds in the world sat inside a secured compound in Islamabad, Pakistan. 21 hours of negotiations, back-channel pressure, shuttle diplomacy, and closed-door arguments. The rest of the world was not supposed to know about any of it, but in 2026. Nothing stays secret for long. And after all of that, after the flights, the security details, the translators, and the careful language, they walked out of that building with absolutely nothing. No agreement, no ceasefire, no framework document, not even a promise to meet again, just silence. And then Vance stepped in front of the cameras, the vice president of the United States did not express regret. He did not offer diplomatic language about continued dialogue or ongoing efforts toward peace. He looked directly into the lens and said 3 words. Bad news for Iran, 3 words. That is all it took. And if you understand what those words mean, who said them, in what context, at what moment, then you understand that what collapsed in Islamabad on April 12, 2026 was not just a negotiation. It was potentially the last real off-ramp before this crisis becomes something far larger and far harder to stop. Welcome to Global Brief Alert. This is the story the mainstream media is already moving past, because the full picture is more complicated and more frightening than any single headline can capture, and you deserve the full picture. To understand why Islamabad matters so much, you have to go back to February 2026. That is when the United States and Iran crossed a threshold that Washington had spent years insisting was uncrossable. The public was told this would be fast, clean, and decisive. Officials used confident language, words like overwhelming, unconditional, and finished. The message from Washington was clear: Iran's military capacity would be degraded rapidly, its leadership would face impossible pressure, and the whole thing would be resolved before the international community had time to fully react. Iran did not read that script. What followed was not a quick collapse. What followed was a grinding, costly, deeply uncomfortable conflict that has now been running for over 2 months, and the numbers coming out of it have raised serious questions that the Pentagon has been notably reluctant to answer in public. 24 American aircraft lost, not damaged. Not temporarily grounded, gone. That figure was treated almost as a rumor when defense analysts first started circulating it. The official briefings simply did not reflect losses anywhere near that scale. But the number has held, and the silence from Washington around it has been, in many ways, louder than any press conference could be. When a military campaign is going the way the public is being told it is going, governments do not go quiet about losses. The silence means the narrative does not fit. The choice of Pakistan as a negotiating venue was not random. Pakistan is one of a vanishingly small number of countries that maintains functional diplomatic relationships with both Washington and Tehran. It is nuclear armed, which gives it strategic weight that smaller neutral countries simply cannot offer. Its government, deeply aware of what a wider regional war would mean for South Asian stability, quietly offered to host. Both sides accepted without public announcements. That detail alone tells you something important. Both sides wanted this to work, or at least desperately needed to be seen trying. The talks were classified. Within 6 hours they were leaking. Within 12, major international outlets had reporters parked outside the compound. Within 18 hours, the entire world was watching a single building in Islamabad, waiting to find out if the people inside were going to pull the world back from the edge. They were not. The fundamental issue, the issue that has defined this relationship for over 2 decades, was nuclear. The American team arrived with a phased sanctions relief structure. Real economic relief for Iran, delivered in stages, tied to verifiable limits on uranium enrichment. Not the full 2015 nuclear agreement, but a real starting point. Tehran said no, not a conditional no, an immovable, absolute no, no enrichment ceiling, no international monitoring mechanism, no compliance timeline. The nuclear program was simply not on the table, not as part of this negotiation, not now, not ever. The American team pushed, they reframed, they tried different sequencing and offered to separate certain elements entirely. Nothing moved, and then came the detail that, according to sources, genuinely infuriated the American delegation inside that room. Iran was not just refusing the nuclear terms. Iran was actively trying to split the conversation, negotiate a military ceasefire on one track while leaving the nuclear program completely untouched on another. For Washington, that was the line. A ceasefire that leaves Iran's nuclear program running unrestricted is not a peace deal. It is a strategic gift. The talks ended, and Vance walked to the cameras. Here is the question nobody in Washington wants to answer on camera. If the Islamabad talks were always going to fail, if Iran was never going to put its nuclear program on the table and Washington was never going to accept a ceasefire without it, then why did 21 hours of senior-level negotiations happen at all? There are two possible answers. Both of them should make you deeply uncomfortable. The first is that someone genuinely believed a deal was reachable, that Iran had privately signaled flexibility it was unwilling to show publicly, and that Islamabad represented an honest last attempt to find it. If that first answer is true, then what happened inside that compound was a genuine collapse, a real failure, the last credible off-ramp disappearing in real time. And the world is now standing on a road with no exits, moving toward something nobody has a clean plan to stop. The second answer is darker. The talks were never primarily about reaching an agreement. They were about optics, about being seen trying, about giving Washington the political cover to say when the next phase of this conflict begins that every option was exhausted and what comes next was not a choice but a necessity. If the second answer is correct, then bad news for Iran was not a reaction to failure. It was always the intended headline. The statement was not frustration. It was a signal deliberately prepared before Vance ever walked to that podium. Global Brief Alert is not here to tell you which answer is right. We are here to make sure you are asking the question. While diplomats were sitting in Islamabad, something else was happening in the Persian Gulf that received a fraction of the coverage it deserved. Naval movements, Iranian positioning, American vessels changing formation, the kind of maneuvering that experienced military observers recognize immediately as pre-escalation behavior, the kind that happens in the days before something significant, not after. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that gap flows a volume of energy and raw materials the global economy simply cannot function without. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through it every single day. But oil is not actually the most alarming number. The alarming numbers connect directly to food. 47% of the world's sulfur supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz, 24% of global ammonia, 35% of the urea that farmers across Asia and Africa depend on to grow food at scale. These are the chemical building blocks of fertilizer, the inputs that determine whether crops grow or fail across entire continents. When those shipments are disrupted, and they are already being disrupted right now, the effects do not stay in the Persian Gulf. They travel through supply chains into the price of food in countries that have no political stake in this conflict at all. Analysts studying agricultural supply chains have already flagged that by midsummer, ordinary people far from this war will begin feeling the effects directly, not on a news screen, not in a diplomatic briefing, in grocery stores, in marketplaces, in family budgets that were already stretched before any of this began. Pakistan, the country that just hosted these collapse talks, is itself deeply exposed to exactly this kind of shock. The irony is almost too heavy to carry. The Strait is Iran's most powerful weapon, and it is one Iran has not yet fully used. To understand why Iran refused to negotiate on its nuclear program, you have to understand what that program represents from Tehran's perspective. Iran's leadership has watched very carefully what happens to governments that surrender weapons programs under American pressure. The pattern they have studied is brutal and consistent. They watched Libya. Gaddafi negotiated, gave up his weapons program, accepted international oversight, and was rewarded with a NATO air campaign that ended with his death and his country becoming a failed state that has never recovered. They watched Iraq, invaded anyway despite having no functional weapons programs by the time the bombs fell. And they watched North Korea, which did not give up its nuclear program, cross the threshold into confirmed nuclear capability, and has since been negotiated with rather than attacked. North Korea's leadership is still in power. Gaddafi's is not. The conclusion Iranian strategists have drawn from that pattern is not emotional. It is coldly logical. The nuclear program is not a bargaining chip. It is the reason they are still at the table at all. Giving it up is not compromise, it is surrender. And no government willingly signs its own strategic death warrant, no matter how much economic pressure it is under. This is the wall the American team hit in Islamabad. While the cameras were pointed at Islamabad, something else sat quietly in the background, the kind of number that does not make dramatic television but shapes everything that follows. The United States government's financial position, heading into an open-ended conflict with no defined endpoint, is not one that supports extended, high-intensity operations indefinitely. Supplemental spending requests associated with this conflict are already climbing past figures that should be generating serious congressional debate. They are not because questioning military spending in wartime feels like disloyalty rather than responsibility, but the bills do not care about political environments. They accumulate. Regardless. History has a name for this pattern. Analysts call it the gambler's fallacy, the moment when someone who has committed too much to a losing position convinces themselves that one more bet will recover everything. One more strike, one more push, one more dramatic move that finally breaks the opponent and makes all the previous costs worthwhile. It never works. The losses compound, the options narrow, the clock runs faster than the strategy can keep up with. And in Islamabad, the clock just got faster. Every analyst watching this conflict closely knows it, and the people inside those decision-making structures know it too. So here is exactly where we are tonight. The talks are dead. Vance has delivered his warning. The Strait of Hormuz is already being disrupted. Iran's nuclear program is running completely untouched. American aircraft losses sit at 24 with no public explanation. And somewhere inside both governments, the next move is already being shaped. Three scenarios are on the table right now. Not possibilities pulled from thin air, but scenarios grounded in military positioning, diplomatic language, and the historical patterns of how conflicts like this one have escalated before. Every serious analyst tracking this conflict is watching all three simultaneously. Scenario 1: limited escalation. Washington authorizes a significant strike on a high-value Iranian target. Not nuclear facilities, not yet, but something symbolic and painful enough to signal that the failure in Islamabad carries real consequences. A Revolutionary Guard command center, a missile production facility, something that says, "We tried talking, you refused. Now watch what happens." Iran responds, the cycle tightens another turn. Scenario 2: economic warfare. Washington pivots toward maximum financial pressure, sanctions enforcement at a level not seen before, coordinated with European allies and Gulf states, designed to collapse Iran's ability to fund military operations without firing another shot. It is the slower path, and history suggests it rarely produces the political collapse it is designed to create. Scenario 3, and this is the one nobody wants to say out loud: miscalculation. Not a decision, an accident, a vessel in the strait responding to a perceived threat, a drone crossing a line someone drew in private. A strike that hit something it was not supposed to hit in a theater this compressed, with this many military assets. Operating in close proximity, the most dangerous trigger is often not a strategy. It is a mistake nobody authorized and nobody can take back. That is where this story stands tonight, and the next 48 hours will tell us more about which of those three paths Washington is actually moving toward than any press briefing or official statement will. This is Global Brief Alert, and here is what we need you to do right now. This video took hours of research to build, and the algorithm will bury it within 48 hours unless you act. Share it with one person who deserves the full picture instead of the sanitized version. That single share keeps this signal alive and independent. Subscribe if you have not already, because what just happened in Islamabad is not the end of this story, it is the opening of the most dangerous chapter yet. We will be here every step of the way, covering what others skip, questioning what others accept, and reporting what the mainstream has already moved past. Drop your country in the comments right now. This signal is reaching everywhere, and we want to know exactly where you are watching from, because the next video we are building contains something that connects directly to what just collapsed in Islamabad. Something that changes how you understand everything that has happened since February. You are going to want to be subscribed before it drops. Stay with Global Brief Alert, because the story is just getting started.